I thought of starting this interview by thinking about the people that may be watching and who maybe haven't read your books back in the 70s, in the 80s, and the 90s. And in order to help them get a little bit of a picture what kind of bold predictions you've made and what kind of things you've seen coming, I thought of using two quotes from one of your books from the 90s as a way to get this interview started. And the book I'm quoting from is called Crisis Investing for the Rest of the 90s. And in that book you did predict a greater depression, a depression that's actually greater than the one in the 1930s. And in that book I read, you said, the inflationists will certainly be right in the long run, but they may get wiped out in the short run. In any event, the moment of truth is approaching, and there likely will be a titanic struggle between the forces of inflation and the forces of deflation. Each will probably win, but in different areas of the economy. So in that respect, I think it's absolutely true. We have seen several severe bouts of deflation in 2000, in 2008. And again, a lot of people are starting to fear another crash perhaps in the markets. But at the same time, we've seen the devaluation in Venezuela. We've seen Belarus going into hyperinflation. We're now seeing Japan minus 18%, the third most traded currency in the world. In the past few months, the British pound seems to be running into trouble. So it seems to me that maybe we are in the period you were talking about 20 years ago. We're seeing this titanic struggle between the two forces. And my question to you is, do you agree with that? And if so, which force do you think is winning out in the short run?
Well, from a fundamental point of view, nothing has changed. The thing that surprises me is that it's taken so long. But there's an old saying, things that you expect to happen usually take longer than you think, but once they actually get underway, they usually happen much more quickly. And that's the situation that we're in now. As we speak, we're at we had a stock market bubble in the late 90s, and then we had a gigantic real estate bubble in the 2000s. Now we're in a much bigger and much more serious bubble. We're in a bond bubble. The bond markets are the biggest markets in the world, and these governments have intentionally, through their central banks' actions, driven interest rates down to all-time low levels, the lowest not just in our lifetime, but since the Industrial Revolution. And
actually, I checked the rates for 10-year bonds in Holland. There's a graph I saw recently, and in Holland it's actually the lowest rate in over 500 years.
Yeah, I mean, people buy bonds because they think it's risk-free reward, but actually today, with interest rates at close to zero, it's reward-free risk. I mean, bonds are a triple threat to your capital. You've got the default risk, and in a heavily indebted world that we are today, the risk of default is much greater than it is in a world where there's not much debt. You've got the currency risk, and with all of these governments, the Europeans, the Americans, the Chinese, the Japanese, printing up their currency units by the trillions, you've got a huge currency risk with bonds. And the last thing is the interest rate risk. With interest rates, bonds fluctuate inversely with interest rates. Mm-hmm. So interest rates double, bonds go down 50%, more or less. And people forget that in the early 80s, interest rates all around the world were 12, 15, 18%, even on government paper. So this is a deflationary force when interest rates inevitably go up for a lot of reasons. I mean, all things fluctuate. When you have trillions of dollars worth of bonds and their current market value goes in half and then in half again, That's trillions of dollars of purchasing power that's wiped out. So that's the deflationary part. But on the other hand, these governments want to keep things the way they are, and they'll print up more money. So this is the powers of inflation and deflation working against you. Inflation is something that's caused exclusively and totally by the government, because the government is what prints up money. Deflation is more of a market force. When the stock market crashes, it wipes out hundreds of billions of funny money. The real estate market crashes, bonds default. That wipes out the money. So I'm a fan of deflation from a philosophical point of view. But as a speculator, I'm very happy to see more inflation. These governments will destroy their currencies. Of course, when they do that, that's going to have huge social and political ramifications, because the productive people of the world that produce more than they consume, they save the difference. But how do they save the difference? Almost everybody does their saving in currency.
Absolutely. And bonds are, in a way, just a promise to pay currency in the future.
Exactly.
Right. I checked the rate of the average European investor right now, and I believe if you consider that pension funds have over 50% in bonds, over 75% is actually in paper of people's family wealth. It's either cash or bonds.
Yeah, owning a bond today is much more dangerous than owning Apple stock when it was at $700 a share. Much more dangerous. So, for the three reasons I gave.
Right.
So, no, this is an accident just waiting to happen. Now, on the other hand, I'm pleased that the Greater Depression hasn't materialized. And the reason that it hasn't materialized is two things. One is that the average person out there, or many average people, do produce more than they consume, and that's how the world becomes wealthier, okay? And the second thing is that technology keeps advancing. There are more scientists and engineers alive today than have ever lived altogether in the past. And these two things, if a depression can be defined as a period of time when most people's standard of living drops significantly, then these other two factors, individual savings and technology, increase people's standard of living. So they counterbalance. But I anticipate a real financial catastrophe, like what happened in the 1930s.
So would you say that the dilemma between either betting on deflation or betting on inflation is kind of a false dilemma?
Well, since we don't know exactly which is going to happen, you've got to guard against both. And this is why I am and have been for forever a huge fan of gold. Because since gold is the only financial asset that's not simultaneously somebody else's liability, it represents wealth in itself. So it profits from inflation as more people panic into gold to get out of currency. And if there's a deflation, it also, because it can't be destroyed.
Right.
Like a currency.
Yeah, we've seen a really fast rebound in 2008, and I don't know, but you think it's possible that investors more than back then will anticipate huge money printing in order to stimulate the economy again right after the perhaps coming deflationary correction in the markets?
Sure.
So that maybe gold won't go down as much as it has a couple of years ago?
No, I'm really not very worried about gold. Let me say that as we speak right now, gold is about $1,600 an ounce. As a speculator, I'm not terribly interested in gold. I was very interested in gold and bought a lot of gold and gold stocks back in 2000, 2001, 2002. It was a fantastic speculation. I mean, people forget that at $250, $275 per ounce, which gold was back then, it was actually cheaper in real terms, real dollars, than gold was at $35 an ounce back in 1971. So it was if not a once in a lifetime, but a twice in a lifetime gift. Now at 1600, gold has gone up a lot, and I don't like to buy things that have gone up 5 or 6 or 7 times in a decade.
But then again, it's still money.
But it's still money. So I don't buy gold for capital gains. I buy it for safety, for prudence,
right,
for insurance. But that said, I think gold is going higher. And I think that you'll increase your real wealth by owning gold. But the object at this point is not to increase your real wealth, just to keep your real wealth.
Right.
Because in a depression, everybody loses. The person that wins is the person that loses the least.
Well, that maybe leads into my next question, which is another quote from your book from 20 years ago. You wrote that in this Greater Depression, all the real wealth will still be there, but its ownership will change. The people who wind up wealthy as the Greater Depression unfolds will predictably be those who understand what's going on.
Yes, that's exactly right.
So in that respect, I'm sorry, my question is, can you say a little bit more about how exactly that wealth transfer, the big wealth transfer, would take place? And maybe because my readers are European, and I'm always curious to hear people from the outside talk about what's happening in the continent. Maybe for Europe, how do you see that wealth transfer happening in Europe?
Well, Europe is a big problem because sociologically, psychologically, philosophically, Europe has been totally corrupted and totally overwhelmed by these insane and destructive socialist ideas, where people actually think that the government is a cornucopia, that it can create wealth, that it can make everything better. But to me, the institution itself of government, I'm not talking about this group of politicians or that group of politicians, the institution of government itself is destructive. As Mao Tse-tung said, it's pure force. It comes out of the barrel of a gun. So the problem with Europe is that everybody is extremely government-centric. They're suspicious of people that create real wealth. They're suspicious of people that have wealth. So I think that the future for Europe is very grim, quite frankly.
So does that mean you see a perpetual bottom? You see a perpetual crisis?
You know what, I think that the current system in Europe of the welfare state has really got to be washed away.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this is one of the reasons I look forward to the bankruptcy of most of these governments around the world, because at that point they won't be able to pay on the obligations that they've incurred to the people. Now, the question is it going to get worse at that point? I mean, as bad as these welfare states are in Europe, they're destructive of human productivity. They're destructive of the human spirit. They're just horrible things, even though people like them because they think they're getting something for nothing.
Mm-hmm.
But what I'm afraid of is when these governments all go bankrupt, that I say, well, gee, that's great. Maybe things will get better because you wash away all these old distortions. But with any organism, the most important thing, its prime directive is survive.
Mm-hmm.
And these governments will try to survive. But how can a government survive? It doesn't produce anything. It only survives by taking in more taxes from the people in its bailiwick. So it's good news and bad news.
So would you agree that we have to, if we have gold today, we can see what comes and see how things evolve, and I presume in the 30s there were some signs that things were going the wrong way in Europe, and one was a lot wiser to buy stocks in the US, for example, than to buy stocks in Europe. Do you think that it's wise to wait things out a bit and to see whether we see, because right now it seems to me that in Europe we do see a lot of problems, but maybe it's a bit early to speak of civil war already breaking out very soon, or real wars, or do you think I'm wrong with that assessment?
Well, I wasn't alive in the 30s, so
right.
But it seems like there were a lot of straws in the wind. In retrospect, you can see that there were straws in the wind, and some people saw them at the time. The Spanish Civil War and the problems in the Balkans in those days, and the collectivist regimes which rose up in Italy and in Germany and in Russia. So you could see that there was something that was going to happen. But where do I think we are right now? Well, look, one of the big problems with these governments being bankrupt is, and problems in the economies of all these countries, is that they like to blame somebody else for the problems. So you can see it happening with the US. They blame those damn Chinese for filling Walmart full of cheap goods, unemploying American workers who can buy wonderful cheap stuff, but they forget about that. And they blame those damned Arabs for having oil. I mean, what's our oil doing under their sand? So that's something. And they blame the Iranians for this. So, and the worst thing about the U.S. is that it's got this gigantic military, and it's like a hammer. And when the only thing you've got that works is a hammer, then everything starts to look like a nail. So yeah, I see big trouble.
And I think, talking about Europe, I think so far the blame has been mostly internal, like they blame the rich or they blame the industrialists, because there is seems to me a very, the politicians, most of them are from the multicultural brand, but more and more we see in Europe elections being won by right-wing parties who are actually, again, blaming foreigners, whom they of course invited all those years with these welfare programs and all that. So I don't know, perhaps it's true. Perhaps it's true that again we'll see this this violence to the outside, and usually that leads to war or other kinds of upheaval. And maybe that's a lead into our next question, is that it seems to me today that a lot of Europeans are becoming restless and thinking about the possibility of moving outside to a better place, maybe not even permanently, but just to start, maybe 6 months a year or something. What would you say to those people? Like, I know how to get started, and what are the kind of places that people ought to consider when thinking about making such a move?
I'd say they're highly intelligent because throughout world history, the best people have always been the opportunity seekers. And that means people that go someplace else to look over the next mountain and see what's there. The trouble with a lot of troubles with Europeans and Americans too, is that they have that medieval serf mentality. They were born there, they have friends there, somebody gave them a job, and they'll stay there. They'll root themselves there like a plant. But unfortunately, being a plant isn't a very good survival strategy for a human being. If I was a European today that had some capital, some savings, I'd get the hell out of Europe, because in Europe you're paying income tax that's huge. You're paying VAT taxes. You're just taxed to death. The government of every European country treats you like a milk cow. So if you have capital, get out of Europe and go someplace else where the capital is welcome, where your tax situation is vastly improved, where you won't be treated like a serf, and it'll be easier for you to stop thinking like a serf. So my advice to any European, and certainly to any American, is get out of your home country and diversify yourself geographically and politically, because your biggest risk in the world today is not a market risk for what could happen to the stock market, the bond market, the currency market. These are risks, they're serious. But the biggest risk you have is a political risk, and it's basically from your own government. So especially if you're a European and you can live tax-free and free otherwise someplace else in the world, especially since you have unique experiences from being in a sophisticated European country. If you go to a less sophisticated country, you're unique. You're not just one of millions of people. You're a very unusual person.
Oh yeah, I agree. And also I think today with the, I mean, thinking back, like all those people that made these moves, and I talked to some that made the move in the 50s. I mean, that must have been amazing, because you had no clue what was waiting for you. You were sitting in a boat for 3 weeks. If you wanted to keep touch with the home front, maybe you write a letter, maybe 1 month later it arrives. I mean, today we can talk to people and see them. I mean, you can see them on Skype, you can, and it's all free. It doesn't cost a lot of money to make the phone calls. So, and also, even before you've moved, there's so many things you can do. You can maybe even find a job abroad, even before you've set one step outside the country.
Precisely. And because you're different from the locals, you have a different set of knowledge and background and connections, the opportunities for entrepreneurialism are much higher.
Right. Well, we're sitting here in Buenos Aires, Argentina. I'm curious to know a little bit more about your thoughts about South America going forward. Is this one of those places where you think, well, here are the opportunities for the coming, I don't know, maybe 2, 3, 4 decades?
Well, I'm a big fan of Latin America. If I was, I mean, look, I'm in my mid-60s right now, so I'm not interested in doing the same things that I was when I was in my 20s and 30s. That's just the natural thing. If I was in my 20s and 30s or even 40s, yeah, South America would be interesting, but Africa would be much more interesting. I would go to Africa. Because you can go to almost any. I was thinking of doing a television show, actually, to send in a team and see if at the end of 1 week somebody could be sitting down to the president of some nothing nowhere African country and pitching him on a deal. It's possible. I've done it a number of times. So it's easy to do things like that in Africa. And Africa needs everything. It has all kinds of undeveloped wealth. The Chinese are taking advantage of it. So if you're a real opportunity seeker, I'd say go to Africa. On the other hand, I've spent a lot of time in the Orient over the years, and the fact of the matter is that the Orientals, the Chinese in particular, are going to really eat the lunch of everybody in the West. I mean, I've said before, and I'll say it again, that in 2 generations, upper middle class Chinese families will mostly use Europeans and Americans for houseboys and maids. The shoe will be on the other foot. So I would in
the same way as that the Romans were using Greek, the sophisticated Greeks as house serfs.
Exactly, or the way that in the past everybody liked to have a Chinese houseboy. So the shoe is going to be on the other foot. It's going to.
And you think South America will be more of a neutral place? Because I'm thinking about, for example, the fact that it is the breadbasket of the world, and China is dependent on South America for a lot of grain imports, for example. Do you think that will help it to retain its independence in the world?
Yeah, I do. I'm bullish on South America. I mean, the governments here are very destructive and stupid. I mean, look at the Argentine government, for instance. I mean, it's almost a comedy show where every week they do something more stupid than the week before. But all these governments down here are bad. The best ones in South America, I think the countries that actually have the most opportunity, I would direct people's attention to Colombia and to Chile. they're going the right direction. They have been going the right direction for many years. The trend is likely to continue for a while. I also like these obscure countries, like you can forget French Guiana because that's actually a department of Paris, but Guyana and Suriname are actually quite interesting. Very small.
You never heard from them.
You never hear about them, and if you want to make it in the business world or the speculative world, you've got to go where other people aren't. So Colombia, Chile, high standards of living, countries going the right direction, and I would suggest Guyana and Suriname for somebody that's really looking to hit a long ball home run.
Wow. Well, talking about going where nobody's going or where few people are going, I met you in Salta in your estancia a couple of months ago in November, and I gave you a little gift, and it was worth $10 back then.
Thank you very much.
And you told me that it's going to go up a lot in value, and you were absolutely right. It went up a lot. It tripled in value. It's actually worth more than a silver coin. And of course, I'm talking about Bitcoin. I gave you a little physical Bitcoin. So I'm curious because you've been around for so long, and you've seen so many fads come and go, and I'm curious what your take on Bitcoin is so far. Do you think it's something that's going to just wither away in a couple of years as a little fancy trend, or does it have does it have a lasting quality to it, you think?
Well, it seems to me that the big advantage of Bitcoin is that it's totally private. That's a huge advantage in a world today where governments can track bank accounts everywhere, wire transfers everywhere. The fact that it's extremely private, that's its marginal advantage. So it's a fantastic medium of exchange from that point of view. But the other thing that money has to be is it has to be a store of value. And I know that Bitcoin, the amount of them is limited. But that doesn't make it a store of value. So
what would it take to have that quality? Because the problem is with on the one hand the fact that the reason why it's so private seems to me, and also according to the ECB who wrote a big report on it, is that there is nothing. It's not backed by anything. That's that fact causes the government to be not able to confiscate anything. There is nothing there. It's just a couple of numbers.
Yeah.
I
don't know. It may be, in the long run, I'm afraid that Bitcoin is going to turn into what's known as a trading sardine, as opposed to an eating sardine.
So what does it mean? It will be used as a speculation rather than as real currency?
Yeah, it's a convenience. I mean,
okay.
But for the long run, I can't see it. And also, Bitcoin has the first mover advantage, but it seems to me there's no reason why another entrepreneur can't do Bitcoin identical, and then somebody says, "Oh, I'll do Bitcoin, Zipcoin." So you could have identical clones after a while.
Right.
I mean, all these things are problematical, but I certainly acknowledge the fact that it's necessary and successful at the moment. But I wouldn't plan on leaving my Bitcoins to my children if I were you.
Right. No,
but I would leave my gold coins to my children.
Right. But it does seem to at least to widen the discussion about competing currencies a lot, in that we now have, for the first time, a digital currency that's actually, taken up the gloves against all these government currencies who have been digital, very fungible, very easy to deal with for a long time. So I'm excited that the debate is actually getting much more intense because of this.
Oh, absolutely. No, listen, I'm a huge fan. Let 100 flowers bloom, and I hope that next week somebody comes up with an improved version of that's even better. And so no, it's it's wonderful. I'm just cautious
Sure.
about the long term because it doesn't have value in and of itself.
Right.
That's the
Yeah, I
problem.
remember us having the discussion in Cafajate, and you said the same. Like, well, who prevents an entrepreneur from inventing a new Bitcoin? And then I said, well, yeah, but you could have the same discussion with Coca-Cola because we were talking about that before.
Right.
Somebody can come up with a new version of Coca-Cola, and then there were many kinds, which is what we have today.
But that's true. So the market will decide.
Absolutely.
I'm just cautious.
All right. Well, thanks so much for that. Because I'm just intrigued always to ask people about these things that have been around for a long time, and I get a lot of cautious answers. So I think it's definitely in the speculative field rather than in the field of investing.
I mean, owning Bitcoin is not like owning farmland or owning a
Right.
gold coin.
It's scars by design and not scars by nature.
Yeah, it's a trading vehicle. It's good for convenience and therefore necessary and useful. But that may be a temporary phenomenon as the economy changes.
So you're saying maybe one day you'll use Bitcoin to ship some of your gold to another country? You liquidate your gold in one country and then buy it again in another country?
That's entirely possible. I wouldn't want that trade to extend for 10 years,
Right.
but for 10 days or 10 hours, no problem.
Right. Let's see what else I wanted to talk about. There was this question I had about being a contrarian. Maybe there's something you can teach us about how to deal with psychologically tough times, because right now it seems for a lot of gold and gold speculators, gold investors, it's hard because we see on the one hand gold that's just trending downwards, it seems for the moment, or at least stagnating, and then on the other hand we have this based on consumption boom of and of course of stimulation of stocks. So what would you say to people that are having a tough time right now because they bought gold and they experience the pain of being a contrarian?
Look, I'd say the markets fluctuate, but at this stage in the world's economic history, I can't think of a better asset, financial asset to own than gold. I really can't. And sure, it can go down $100 in a day. That's possible. That maybe there's some big institution that has some gold and it gets into trouble and it needs dollars to pay its debt, so it has to sell the gold. These things fluctuate unpredictably and randomly, but you can't pay attention to them. You have to keep your eye on the economic fundamentals. And the economic fundamentals in the world today are very shaky. Counterparty risk. You can't trust any bank. You can't trust any broker. I mean, you want to have a financial asset in your own hands. And even at $1,600, I feel fine with gold. I actually feel better with silver at $30 an ounce, more or less where it is. And listen, I bought gold at $35 an ounce. I bought silver at $1.29 an ounce. I mean, years ago, and I feel fine about buying it at these prices today. Because you've got to realize that the dollar and every other currency unit is a floating abstraction, and these governments must, at this point, keep the ball rolling, print up trillions more of them, and they're going to do it, and they're going to destroy all their paper currencies. It's going to happen. I mean, paper currencies, whether we're talking the euro or the dollar or the British pound, they all have a half-life. They're like radioactive elements. So
Yeah, like the assignats and the paper marks.
yeah, I mean, why do people think that things are different? In fact, they're not only not different, but the way things are building up today, this coming financial upheaval, and it could happen in 2013 or 14, or maybe, it'll be delayed until 2020. That'd be wonderful, because I prefer good times to bad times. They're much more pleasant. It's not pleasant when people lose everything and they can't eat and they're rioting in the streets. So I hope that but the longer they put off the hour of reckoning, I'm afraid the worse it's going to be when it happens.
Right.
So, look, I guess the bottom line is, if you own gold and silver, congratulate yourself and buy more the lower it goes. Every day, I'm not rooting for gold to go up. I'm rooting for gold to go down. I like to buy things when they're cheap.
Just like you like to buy a house when it's cheap, or bread when it's cheap, or...
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. That's exactly right.
Leading up to our next question, my last question, in fact, it's actually not connected, I'm sorry. But I was intrigued by reading up on what you've done and how you've done it. And not only have you been a very successful market analyst, but you've also built a company, KC Research, that's doing very well. And I'm curious to learn, what are some of the skills you built in being a market analyst that have proved useful in the field of business, and also vice versa? I'm curious, what are some of the business skills you think are useful? Maybe people that are entrepreneur today, what are some of the skills they'll be able to use if they want to become an investor or a speculator?
Right, right. Well, I don't consider myself to be a businessman, actually. A businessman is somebody that hires and manages people and supervises them, and a man's got to know his limitations. You got to know what you're good at, and that doesn't interest me very much.
But maybe it's part of the answer. Maybe the fact that you know your own limits meant that you didn't overextend, and you delegated what was to be delegated. For example,
I mean, I have a couple of partners that are interested in doing those things, and they're competent at it. So I've been very fortunate from that point of view. What I'm good at, because it interests me, and you should only do something that interests you. If you're not interested in doing something, you shouldn't do it. You should find something you are interested in. And what I'm interested in is looking at the world at large and trying to figure out what's cheap, what's dear, what do people want, what are they going to want, and buying or selling. I mean, that's what interests me, and that's what I do. And if that means setting up a business, I'm not going to I'll help to set it up, but I don't want to run the business. In fact, in today's world, it's getting harder and harder to run a business. The regulations about hiring employees, firing them, what you can pay them, Social Security taxes. I mean, it seems like half of the time that anybody's in business is spent complying with government regulations as opposed to producing goods and services for the market. It's completely insane. And that leads me to, I look at, on the one hand, I think the future will not only be good, but better than you can imagine. But on the other hand, I can build an argument why we could have a little dark age in the meantime. Anything can happen.
So interesting times, to say the least.
Yeah, and I just treat this all as an illusion, quite frankly. I mean, it's a question of what you think of reality. And at this point, I mean, I'd be just as happy being a Taoist monk living in the forest as I am, living in the lap of luxury here in Buenos Aires. It's all an illusion.
Well, with that, we finish the interview. Thanks, Doug, so much.
Thanks, it's our pleasure.